The Vought Corsair earned a reputation few aircraft could match, both for its effectiveness in combat and for its bad habit of killing its own pilots. It stayed in production for over a decade, 11 years to be exact, which is longer than any other American fighter of its era, and it was actually the final piston engine fighter ever built for American forces. But the Corsair's story is turbulent, intense, and dark. Although its main focus was World War II, years later one of the aging Corsairs would do something in the Korean War that defied all odds, leaving behind one last story to be told. Its combat deployment began in 1943, and right away, the Corsair gave Allied pilots a sharp edge. It was fast, rugged, heavily armed, and versatile enough to handle both air-to-air combat and ground attack roles. By the final years of World War II, this aircraft had stacked up an 11-to-1 kill ratio. But that did not come without its share of horrors and problems. So let's get back to where it all started. In early 1938, with another global conflict looming, the US Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics began asking for proposals for a new fighter aircraft. They were open to both single and twin-engine designs. One of the companies that responded was Vought. Their engineers centered their new concept around the powerful Pratt Whitney Double Wasp radial engine. To make the most of that engine's horsepower, Vought chose to pair it with a massive Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller, but this brought its own design problems. That propeller was so large, it became difficult to give the landing gear enough clearance without making the struts unreasonably long and fragile. So to fix that, Vought introduced a radical solution, an inverted gull wing. This unique wing shape solved the clearance issue and allowed for shorter and sturdier landing gear, but it did more than that. It also gave the aircraft a cleaner aerodynamic profile. Designers took care to keep the airframe as sleek as possible, reducing drag wherever they could. Air intakes for the intercooler and air cooler were cleverly built into the wing itself. This gave it a sound that would be remembered. At high speed, the Corsair let out a piercing howl, which got it the nickname the Whistling Death by either Japanese or American pilots, depending on who you ask. The pilot sat in a roomy cockpit positioned just behind the wing's trailing edge. However, visibility was not great. The cowling around the engine was bulky, which limited the forward view more than most other single-seat fighters at the time. Side visibility was average at best, and the canopy was heavily framed. The tail surfaces were rounded, and the control surfaces were still fabric covered. Even with these trade-offs, the Navy liked what it saw. In June 1938, they awarded Vought a contract to build a prototype. The first prototype took off on May 29, 1940. A few months later, in October, it reached a top speed of 405 miles per hour, making it the first US fighter to break the 400 mile per hour barrier in level flight. But while the Corsair performed well in speed tests, one serious issue stuck around that would go on to cost many pilots their lives. It was prone to stalling at low speeds. Even worse, the inverted gull wing configuration meant stalls could happen asymmetrically. Depending on conditions, only one side might stall, causing the aircraft to roll unexpectedly, making recovery close to impossible. To improve this, engineers installed a small spoiler on the leading edge of the wing to regulate airflow and added a new stall warning system. At the same time, changes were being made to armament. As the war intensified in Europe, the Navy shifted its priorities and asked for increased firepower. Vought responded by fitting the Corsair with 650 cal machine guns mounted in the wings, but to make room, the wing fuel tanks had to be removed. That meant enlarging the fuselage tank and moving the cockpit nearly 3 feet further back. This relocation, combined with the already long nose, made visibility on carrier landing and in the upcoming dogfights even worse, which was especially dangerous for newer pilots. When we say dangerous, we mean that quite a few pilots hit the deck of the carrier or overshot and fell into the water, or even stalled and turned over just as they were approaching the carrier. Still, most but not all of the critical design issues had been ironed out by 1942, and the Corsair was approved for production. The visibility issue, though, stayed the same. In September 1942, the Corsair underwent its carrier qualification trials. Several problems immediately showed up besides the bad visibility, such as issues with the landing gear, tail wheel, and tail hook systems. And since the Navy was already bringing the Hellcat into service, they decided to delay the Corsair's full deployment until those problems were fixed. British, on the other hand, were desperate for carrier fighters to replace their losses, and they actually found a way to make the Corsair work on their carriers. They introduced a new approach for landing, where the pilot would circle around and turn slightly sideways on approach so he could see the carrier better. In the meantime, the Marine Corps stepped in. By late 1942, the Corsair was being deployed to Marine units based on islands in the South Pacific. It began flying combat missions in large numbers over the Solomon Islands in 1943. Marine pilots quickly took a liking to it. The Corsair's speed and heavy armament gave them a clear advantage against the Japanese Zeros, which were more maneuverable at lower altitudes and lower speeds. The Corsair had a much better climb and dive rate, so they used aggressive boom and zoom tactics to tear through fragile Zeros. They didn't suffer from difficult and dangerous carrier landings as they operated from the ground, so the pilots quickly developed a good connection with it. Kill count started rising fast, and the Corsair made a name for itself in the hands of Marines. For the Navy, the situation was not looking quite good. They didn't officially adopt it until late 1943, and it wasn't until 1944 that the Corsair was fully certified for carrier operations, learning from the British how to make those landings safer. But once they made it possible to be used from carriers and not kill pilots, from then on it flew side by side with the Hellcat, helping defend American ships against the growing kamikaze threat. In terms of pure performance, the Corsair was one of the most capable piston engine fighters ever built. It was faster than the Navy's Hellcat and just 13 miles per hour slower than the P-47 Thunderbolt. But there was one key difference. The Corsair could hit its top speed at 20,000 feet thanks to its mechanically supercharged engine. The P-47 needed to climb to 30,000 feet to do the same. All three aircraft used the same engine, the Pratt Whitney Double Wasp, but the Corsair squeezed every bit of performance out of it. Though American pilots and press widely claimed that the Japanese had coined that infamous whistling death term out of fear, most Japanese records actually referred to the aircraft more simply, calling it the Sikorsky. But the Corsair wasn't just a dogfighter in the Pacific. It quickly also became one of the most effective fighter bombers. It could carry a heavy payload of bombs and rockets, and it provided critical close air support for Allied troops as they fought through brutal island campaigns across the Pacific. Marine pilots began pushing it into this new role, providing close air support with heavy ordnance to amphibious landings. And one of the most unexpected contributors in that role was Charles Lindbergh. Though famous for crossing the Atlantic, Lindbergh had joined the war effort as a civilian technical advisor, but he would also fly combat missions with Marine units in the Pacific and help prove just how much the F4U could handle. He managed to get a Corsair into the air, carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs on the centerline and an additional 1,000 pounds under each wing, which was an incredible payload for a single-engine fighter. He used this loadout to carry out bombing runs on Japanese positions during the battle for the Marshall Islands. By 1945, the Corsair was performing full-time ground attack missions, dropping high-explosive bombs, rockets, and even napalm. It became a crucial part of the campaigns for Palau, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. By the time the war ended, the Corsairs were credited with shooting down 2,140 Japanese aircraft. In return, they only lost 189 of their own. That is a kill ratio of more than 11 to 1. Across the war, Corsairs flew over 64,000 combat sorties, and only 15% of those missions were actually launched from carriers. The rest came from land bases. The Corsair was also used by other Allied air forces and dropped over 15,000 tons of bombs, which is about 70% of all ordnance dropped by American fighter aircraft. But when World War II ended, it was not the end for Corsair service. When the Korea War broke out in 1950, most of the world had already left propeller-driven fighters behind. Jet aircraft had taken over the skies, and piston-engine planes like the Corsair were seen as relics of the past. But Korea presented a very different kind of battlefield. The terrain was mountainous and the front lines moved constantly, so the need for precise, low-altitude strikes remained critical. In that environment, high-speed jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre often flew too fast and too high to be useful for close air support. That left a gap that the Corsair could still fill. While it was no longer suited for dogfighting against jets like the new MiG-15, it remained highly effective in ground attack roles. But sometimes exception would disprove the rule. On September 10, 1952, Marine Captain Jesse G. Folmar was flying a Corsair alongside his wingman on a mission to support ground forces under attack. During the flight, to their horror, they spotted several MiG-15s approaching from above, already diving to attack and opening fire. Both pilots immediately dropped their external fuel tanks and any remaining ordnance to lighten their aircraft. Then they dove into tight evasive maneuvers as the MiGs opened fire. One MiG pilot made a fatal error as he tried to outturn the Corsair at low altitude. Captain Folmar took the chance. He swung his Corsair around and opened fire from his 420mm cannons. A burst hit the MiG, which began trailing smoke, then caught fire. The MiG pilot ejected moments before the jet crashed into the ground. Moments later, a couple more MiGs dived in and opened fire. Folmar's Corsair was hit and shot down, but he managed to bail out safely. He parachuted into the sea and was picked up and rescued just minutes later. The very last time the F4U saw combat was in 1969 during the brief but intense football war between El Salvador and Honduras. In that conflict, Honduran Air Force Captain Fernando Soto flew a Vought F4U Corsair and managed to shoot down one P-51 Mustang and two Goodyear-built FG Corsairs flown by El Salvador. That final skirmish marked the end of a long and storied combat career. For the US Navy though, the Corsair's official service ended after Korea, but by then it had already gone into history as one of the most beautiful yet deadly aircraft with quite a turbulent war service.